Hi, I'm Jason Odell, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about color management. Now, color management is critical for any photographer, anybody doing graphics arts work, because it allows you to standardize the way your image is going to look across any number of computers. The first and most critical step of any proper image management workflow is to have a calibrated display, a calibrated monitor. Now, some computers will come with software that says here we can use this to fine-tune your display and you eyeball it and click things that are red and green, blue, whatever. But the only way to truly get a properly calibrated monitor without any bias is to use a hardware device called a colorimeter. Now, I have one right here. This particular colorimeter is a Spyder. S-P-Y-D-E-R, but there's lots of different brands. You can get different ones. But as long as you've got a hardware device to accurately read the colors from your display, you can produce what's called a monitor profile. Now, why is this important? Well, it turns out that every monitor is told by your computer to display a certain red, green, blue RGB value. But not every monitor will produce the same color. There's going to be variation. And this shows up in the form of color casts. You might have a greenish cast, a bluish cast, whatever. The problem is our eyes are so good at compensating for color casts that we just don't notice them. So we need an unbiased hardware device to look at the colors that are produced when the computer tells the monitor to display a particular RGB value. If it finds differences between what is coming out of the display and what it was told to produce, the software that comes with the colorimeter is going to produce what's called a monitor profile. Think of it like eyeglasses for your computer screen. This is going to allow it to properly render colors on your screen no matter what image you provide it. Once your monitor is calibrated, you're going to have a standardized baseline to make for all of your images. So let's take a look at how we use this. I've plugged in my Spyder and I've launched its software. So I'm going to go ahead and follow the on-screen instructions. So I'm just going to click the next button. And eventually you get to a prompt where it says, place the device here on the screen. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to take my Spyder and I'm going to stick it on the screen. Just hang it up here. Use the little suction cup. Attach this. And at this point, I'm ready to start the calibration process. What's going to happen is the software is going to generate a long set of color patches from black to white, every color in between, and this device is then going to read the actual spectrum value that's produced by the monitor. So we click Next, and the color patch process is going to begin. Now this is going to take, depending on your computer, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. So let's let this run and we'll come back when it's finished. Okay, you have to wait a little while for it to go through all the patches, but once we're done, it'll tell you to remove the device. So I'm just going to take the Spyder off and put it back in its little holder and click Finish. And at that point, you'll get a dialog box that asks you to create a name for your profile. You can call it My Monitor, or if you have multiple monitors, give it a name. And I'm going to go ahead and click Save, and it saves the profile. And then the last screen that'll come up, at least in the case of the Spyder software, is that it'll show you before and after. I can look at these sample images, and if you look at my monitor, the screen takes on a very different cast when I turn off the profile. Okay, so that's the steps to calibrate your monitor, and if you do it right, with most computers, it creates this profile, it stores it in your system information, and you don't need to worry about it again. The trap that many people fall into is improperly setting their editors to use this monitor profile, and that's something you don't ever want to do. Okay, so let's say we're using Photoshop or any editor. The trick is to set the default color working space. And there's usually 3 spaces that as a photographer you might be interested in using. You might be interested in using sRGB profile, Adobe RGB, or ProPhoto RGB. Those are the 3 options that you should select from when you're choosing an editing space. The difference between those three spaces is the number of colors that they contain. sRGB is a very narrow space. ProPhoto RGB is a very wide space. And as a general rule of thumb, we like to work in a big space and then save output in a more narrow space if you're going to say send it to the web. So you might see people convert to sRGB. You can go ahead and work in the sRGB space if you like, if you don't want to worry about changing things back and forth. But just understand that if you do that, you're going to have a much narrower gamut of colors with which to play around with. Now, if you're shooting RAW in your camera, you can oftentimes produce a much wider amount of colors and tones if you use the Adobe RGB or even the ProPhoto RGB space. Just remember, when you go to save a JPEG, we're going to convert that to the sRGB space when we're done. So let's take a look at how we might set that up.
Okay, here I am in Adobe Photoshop. And what we want to do in Photoshop is set our default editing preferences. So from Photoshop, you can go to the Edit menu and choose Color Settings. And you'll get a dialog box that comes up. And from here, you can choose the default working space. And you can see that they're grouped into all the profiles that are added in. What you don't want to do is use your monitor RGB. That's the wrong approach. So you can choose sRGB, ProPhoto, Adobe RGB, whatever you might want to do. I've chosen ProPhoto. It's a large space. It's usually what I work with in my RAW editor. So if you're using Lightroom, for example, it will default to ProPhoto RGB. You can also set up all of your other RAW image capture applications to use a wide color space. Now, when you do that, you just have to keep in mind that when you go to save an image for the web, you're going to want to convert it down to sRGB. So let's take a look at how you can do that. Here's my image in Photoshop, and let's say that I want to convert it to the sRGB space. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to show the document profile down here at the lower left of the window. And you can see that right now this is a TIFF file and I'm in ProPhoto RGB 16 bits per channel. If I want to make a copy of this file for the web, I would go ahead and resize it, do all of that stuff, but we'd need to change it to the sRGB space. So I'm going to go to Edit, Convert to Profile, and then I'm going to choose sRGB as the destination space. And here you get the options to use relative colorimetric, perceptual. Usually we choose either perceptual or relative colorimetric when we're working with photographs. And you'll want to make sure that this black point compensation button is checked. So I click OK, and it converts it. And now you see it now says down here sRGB, and you can follow that along. So if I save this copy for the web, it's going to be saved as sRGB, and it's going to be shown properly in your browser. Now, if I don't convert it to sRGB, let's take a look and see what would happen if you view this image in a browser. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this, and we don't need to save it. I'm going to bring the image up in Photomechanic, which is a quick, easy way of showing you what the preview will look like in a color managed or non-color managed way. So here is the TIFF that we had saved, and it was in ProPhoto RGB. I'm going to check off, untoggle the color matching icon, and what you can see now on the screen is that this really looks ugly. All the colors look faded, washed out, and there's even kind of a greenish tinge to everything. So this is what your customers or your visitors to your website are going to see in most browsers if you don't take the steps to convert your image from your big color space to the sRGB space. If the user is using a color managed browser, well, it won't matter. But sRGB is the universal, safe color space to use when you're saving something out for the web.